me, prior to coming to faith, one of the big things that got in the way was I thought the Bible was a collection of fairy tales. And the idea that science was in any way related to the Bible was totally foreign to me. Didn't know what was in the Bible, had never read it, but my presumption was that anybody who was heavily into the Bible was not into science. As you study history, you find that it's a very different story. Now, the first thing to be aware of is that what the Bible says is there is general revelation. Now, general revelation is a theological term. Theologians use that because they need to classify everything. But the point of it is that God reveals himself in nature. Key scripture is Romans chapter 1 and verse 20. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. What that's really saying is that somebody who is in Africa, or in the deepest jungles, and has never heard the gospel, has never heard about God, nonetheless should know that there is a master intelligence, a person who has created all of this. Because within nature, you see such incredible beauty and complexity and the rest. We'll look a little bit more at that as we consider these things today. But the reality is people do not reject God for lack of evidence. They reject God as a matter of the will, choosing to do by nature our own wills rather than God's will. General revelation says God has splashed it out there. You can look at it in the stars. You can look at it when you look at the heavenly bodies. You can look at it when you look at nature. You can see God's work when you look at your own body. We are fearfully and wonderfully made. That is general revelation. There are no words. It's just an exhibit of what God has done all around us. Now, Einstein's interesting because here is a guy who came to some level of faith through general revelation. It is the structure of the universe that brought him to faith. He said this, I believe in a God who reveals himself in the harmony of all that exists. I am convinced that God does not play dice. In other words, this is not the result of randomness. That what we see is based on a plan. Interestingly, in 1979, I had just graduated from seminary, and I attended a little church in Luling, Louisiana, tiny little town near New Orleans. And in a Sunday school group there, I met a woman, elderly woman, who had been Einstein's maid in Princeton, New Jersey, for decades. And this was after he had died. And she shared several stories about his faith and confirmed that this incredible genius was not too smart to believe in God, that what he had seen had brought him to some level of faith. He believed there was a God. Isaac Newton said that the whole reason that he searched for laws was because he was convinced that there was a lawgiver. It doesn't make sense to look for laws if everything is random. That's, it's kind of like seeing an explosion and then trying to go back and figure out what the mathematical equations were in the explosion, or trying to determine some intelligence based on the explosion. It is only if there is intelligence that you get something to deconstruct. It's only if you have intelligence that you can reverse engineer. And so Isaac Newton was looking for the laws. And of course, the three major laws of thermodynamics are a direct result of that effort. He did quite a bit else besides. Blaise Pascal, phenomenal mathematician, perhaps the greatest. And at a time where you had to develop your own math in a sense. And he wrote in his book, Pensees, what else does this craving and this helplessness proclaim but that there was once in man a true happiness, of which all that now remains is the empty print and trace. This he tries in vain to fill with everything around him, seeking in things that are not there the help he cannot find in those that are, though none can help, since this infinite abyss can be filled only with an infinite and immutable object, in other words, by God himself. And what he is saying there in that lengthy series of sentences is there is a God-shaped vacuum within each one of us that can be filled only by God. Augustine said, our hearts are not at rest until they find their rest in thee. He's a mathematician, hard-nosed, brilliant man. And interesting, he put forth in his writings Pascal's wager. And he said this, he said, human beings, every single one of us, bets with their lives whether God exists or not. How we live our lives is a bet. You're either betting for God's existence or against God's existence. Louis Pasteur, brilliant scientist, he discovered that pathogens cause disease. Up until that point, there were any number of different things that were thought to cause disease. Humors cause disease, any number of things. But he discovered that germs cause disease. As a result, he was the inventor of the very first vaccine. He also invented the whole process of pasteurization, which made milk much safer to drink. He studied science, he said, because he was trying to unlock God's secrets of design hidden in nature. And he wrote this, science brings men nearer to God. Now that would shock many college students today, and certainly their professors. But historically, that is what we have seen. Science has flowed out of the scriptures and based on the idea that there is a God who has put in place an orderly system, far more complex than what we understand currently, but that he reveals over time elements of this incredible complexity. Now, Nikola Tesla, I believe, and many others do as well, that he was the greatest inventor of all time. He firmly believed that God had designed everything in the physical universe. Nothing was accidental. You wind up with a very different result if you approach things based on design. If you're in the pharmaceutical industry and you're trying to cure disease, if you look at the structure of the cell, and if you look at everything based on design, you come to different results than if you think that all of this happened randomly. I can't tell you how many scientific papers, how many published articles on the National Institute of Health website and elsewhere. I'll read things like, this evolved because, and then they give some specious reason without any proof that it was because people needed to avoid starvation that certain things occurred, or crazy ideas. If you look at it in terms of design, everything fits. That's what Tesla believed. The food that's out there that just grows in the field is food for us. It matches our biology. We need the sun. We need vitamin D. It matches our biology. We need the sun as much as plants need the sun. There are processes in our bodies that only work when we have sunshine, and so on. The physical universe is designed for us. I would suggest to you that man is the ultimate expression of God's handiwork, that everything else was in preparation for the design of men and women, and that this was the height of God's achievement. Tesla worked initially for Thomas Edison. He was funded by J.P. Morgan. He partnered with George Westinghouse in the production of the first hydroelectric plants, near the Niagara Falls. And he had major breakthroughs that they said were totally impossible. He invented alternating current generators. They said that was impossible. The direct current generators had several major problems. One was direct current would only go a mile or two. And that was it. You couldn't transmit it over long distances. Another was the direct current generators had brushes that had to constantly be replaced. He designed something they said was impossible, an alternating current generator. He basically designed it in his mind and became convinced it would work. And when he was asked if he thought it would work, he said, well, of course, I can see it in my head. He designed alternating current motors that enabled the modern age. The distribution of electricity over wide distances started with Niagara Falls. It was alternating current, not direct current. The plan Edison had was Everyone would have their own generator, or a grouping of houses would have their own generator, or a building would have their own generator. And that is how electricity would be distributed. Tesla said there's a better way. Edison would test and test and test thousands of different types of filaments to find just one that would work well. And it's for that reason that he famously said genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. It's checking different things and ruling this one out, ruling this one out, ruling this one out. Tesla's approach was, he didn't do any of that. He wasn't really an experimenter in that regard. Now, he did experiments, certainly, but he would visualize what needed to be created, what needed to be invented. And he would pray about it, and he would dream about it. And he said many of his greatest inventions came to him as he slept at night. And he believed firmly that God had revealed these things to him. He claimed his discoveries were revelations from God, and he prayed to God for insights to be revealed to him. He was a man of great faith, and then he would wake up in the morning and he would sketch an invention he had dreamt about, although many times he didn't even sketch it because he had it in his head. It was memorized. He knew exactly what he was going to do. I believe his greatest invention was the wireless transmission of electricity. He assembled a wireless transmission tower in Wardenclyffe, New York, funded by J.P. Morgan, and he successfully demonstrated lighting light bulbs wirelessly many miles away. If I remember correctly, it was 25 miles. It may have been less than that. Just absolutely brilliant. Now, J.P. Morgan then pulled his funding, and then there was a mysterious fire at his lab, and after that, he really never was able to do things at the level he had done previously. He died some years later, almost penniless, living in a hotel room in New York City. For J.P. Morgan, wireless electricity initially seemed like a brilliant idea, but ultimately what he realized was if Tesla were successful, then the fortune that Morgan had made off of wired transmission of electricity would appreciate pretty dramatically overnight. Just like much of the world went straight to cellular. And even today, I mean, relatively few people get wired phones anymore. Same type of thing. So he was a brilliant guy. It's interesting. An interesting quote up at the top there. I don't care that they stole my idea. I care that they don't have any of their own. It was very interesting. He didn't do this for money. He went through several fortunes. He was a quirky guy, but a man of faith. And it was because his belief that God had designed these things, firm belief, that he made the discoveries that he made. Brilliant, brilliant guy. If you've not read much about him, I'd recommend you read it. People primarily know Tesla through the car now or the batteries. That is such a small part of the area in which he worked. Now, that was general revelation, and people looking at things in terms of general revelation. There's also special revelation, where you go to the Bible and you see something that's revealed in Scripture. God revealed details about himself and his creation through the prophets. He spoke through the prophets in the Bible in words that we can understand. So this is not looking at the skies or looking at nature and intuiting that there is an intelligence behind all of this. This is actually reading the words of Scripture, God's words. And these details that are written down in the Bible are testable, and they ultimately serve to build our faith. And for me, that was key to my coming to faith, going to the Scriptures and reading what they had to say about science. I'll share a few of the items that I encountered. Some of them I've shared with you before, and then a few things that you've never heard before. And perhaps not just never heard from me, never heard before. The Bible gives accurate information about the earth. Now, this is thousands of years before Columbus sailed in 1492, trying to find India by going west. But the Bible presents that the earth is a sphere. Now, it's not translated that way, which is kind of an interesting thing. Unlike other ancient texts, the Bible does not state that the earth is flat. You won't go to any passage that talks about the flatness of the earth, nor will you find any of the other bizarre things that you find taught in the Vedic scriptures, the Hindu scriptures, the Bhagavad Gita, Buddhist writings, or anything else. Instead, what the Bible says is that the roundness or sphere of the earth is hung upon nothing. And you see that in two places. In Isaiah 40, verse 22, it says this: God sits enthroned above the circle of the earth, and its people are like grasshoppers. Now, when you look at the word circle, it turns out it's the Hebrew word for ball or sphere. It's quok. I put the Hebrew letters there just in case somebody wants to check it out, but that's what it says. So it translates as circle, sphere, or ball. Very interesting, because when that was written, I doubt that there was a single person on the face of the earth who thought the earth was a sphere. Job 26 and verse 7 says, he spreads out the northern skies over empty space. He suspends the earth over nothing. Now, this is at a time when people thought variously it was on the back of a turtle, Atlas supported the earth, on the back of elephants, any number of different things. The Bible just says he suspends the earth over nothing. It's really only in relatively recent times that we can confirm these things. But not only does the Bible give accurate information about the earth, and by the way, there are a great many other places we could look at things related to the earth, it also gives accurate information about the stars. And again, unique among ancient writings, it gives an amazingly accurate star count. Anaximander is the most widely accepted astronomer of that time in terms of his star count. If you were involved in astronomy several thousand years ago, no telescope, all you could deal with was what you could see with your naked eye. One of the big things they did was count and categorize the stars. Well, he was a Greek astronomer, he was a mathematician, and from Miletus. You may remember that's where Paul met with the Ephesian elders at Miletus to say goodbye to them. And he is best known as the teacher for Pythagoras. You remember your math, Pythagorean theorem? Pythagoras, great mathematician. He taught Pythagoras, and he wrote several tomes. One was about nature. And in that, he said that he had personally counted 3,253 stars. That's the number of stars in the sky, because that's what he could see with the naked eye from Greece. And then you had Hipparchus and Ptolemy a little farther south, certainly Ptolemy was, and they could count about 2,000 stars. Now, obviously, these days, as you get closer to a city, you get down to a handful of stars with the reflected light. Galileo, with a telescope, counted over 30,000 stars. Now, we know today how many stars there are. A lot, a massive number. Sir James Jeans, a British astronomer, he was also a skeptic, by the way, wrote in 1965 in his book, The Stars and Their Courses, he said this, quote, "There are probably as many stars in the universe as there are grains of sand on all the seashores of the world," unquote. Thus, an extremely large, uncountable, finite number. Genesis 22:17 and several other places in the scripture share the Bible's count for stars. So what is the biblical star count? The number of the stars is as the sands of the seas. Long before Sir James Jeans wrote that. In fact, I suspect he didn't even know that that's what the Bible said. There have also been many scientific discoveries from studying Scripture. Matthew Fontaine Maury, for example, discovered the currents in the North Atlantic as a direct result of reading Scripture. The situation he was encountering was that clipper ships were plying their trade between England and the United States, and they would find themselves becalmed with no wind and no current. Some crews perished. Merchants lost money. This was a big thing to try to solve this problem, to see, is there a pathway between England and America that would be safe and constant and would enable the merchants to ply those seas successfully, save the crews, keep them alive, and so on. Well, there's a monument to Maury at the Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, with the caption, Pathfinder of the Seas. You can see that monument on the right-hand side there. And it says below that, which you cannot see, his inspiration, Holy Writ, Psalm 8, that was made highways in the sea for the fish. Well, he discovered that There were two ridges extending from the New York coast to England. So he made charts for ships to sail over one path to England and then to return over the other. His charts are still in use today. A discovery made directly from the Bible. There are many other discoveries made from men reading the Bible. This is just one. Still, even with these things true in history, there are others who still are looking elsewhere for intelligence. Not God, not the Bible. SETI is the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. It was started by the atheist Carl Sagan in 1984. And it was looking for non-random patterns of transmission of electromagnetic waves. So key thing is non-random, something that has intelligence within it. And so far, there have been thousands of SETI observers, and right now there are about 400, and they have found nothing. Nada, not a single thing. Divine intelligence, it turns out, is revealed even in our DNA. You can see it within yourself. SETI searches for non-randomness and patterns in electromagnetic transmissions. Well, DNA is a non-random programming language that has clearly defined and extremely well-structured patterns of active instructions. It's made up of 4 amino acids that are given, typically known just by their first letters, A, G, C, and T, in a specific order located on chromosomes. And you know, if at a certain chromosome, whether it's chromosome 23 or 18 or whatever, certain chromosome in a certain position, if that proper sequence is not there, then somebody has a disease, or they may have some genetic malformation. It is a double helix structure, which builds within it massive redundancy, and it's been called the code of life. It's massive. It is exceedingly complex. Massive in its content of information, not massive in its size. In fact, it's extremely dense. It's minuscule compared to the amount of information it contains. The largest program ever written is the program that is DNA. If it were printed, if your genome, which is your personal program, were printed on 8.5 by 11-inch paper, 20-pound weight, it would be as tall as the Washington Monument. Okay, massive program. But it's compressed to fit in a microscopic cell. Every cell in your body contains your unique programming code. Now, God's designs are not random. When you look at a little baby, the things happening in that little baby's body, even how it came to be, could not have happened based upon something totally random. The scriptures say this in Psalm 139, "For you created my inmost being, you knit me together in my mother's womb." You could almost say you programmed me in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. DNA, it turns out, is the universe's best designed storage medium. It's a storage medium, amongst other things, and it is by far the most efficient storage medium. It's incredibly dense. In other words, all this information is packaged in a very, very, very small package. A bioengineer at Harvard's Wyss Institute was successfully able to store 5.5 petabits of data. Now that's 700 terabytes. A terabyte is 1,000 gigabytes in a single gram of DNA. To give you a better idea of how efficient and densely packaged this is, it is thought that all the knowledge in the world could be stored in a coffee cup using DNA as the storage medium. It is inherently redundant. It has its own backup. So if it's damaged, it backs itself up. And it's extremely stable, and it can survive for hundreds of thousands of years in a box in your garage. It's incredible. So we go back and we've been able now even to track down old dinosaur DNA, mastodons and other things. IBM and others are reverse engineering DNA to be used for storage. Some years back, I was in Kingston and meeting with an IBM fellow who was working on this particular project. And they had successfully been able to get incredible efficiency in terms of the density with a DNA style of storage. The problem they had was, at that time, I don't know if they've solved it, I suspect they have not, it was extraordinarily slow for them to retrieve information. They didn't understand how the retrieval worked. With DNA, we now know that CRISPR can edit the DNA. So you have this storage. It's kind of like the hard drive on your PC or your Mac. And they're able to go into the documents and make modifications. The mRNA vaccines actually wind up making modifications to your DNA. So DNA, quite interesting. Some would say, well, this just happened by accident. It evolved. Kind of hard to believe, the amount of intelligence contained within it. It turns out that not only is a good storage medium, and by the way, one of the things it stores is how do you make a particular protein. So the communication comes to a cell as a chemical messenger. It has a receptor for the various chemical messengers for proteins, hormones, and such. If it gets the message to produce insulin, then at that point, within the cell, there is, you can almost view it as a little factory, and there is a supervisor called a ribosome that goes and selects a little clip from the DNA that is a description of how to make that particular hormone or protein or whatever it's being created. It has the plans right there. Every single one of your cells has that within it. And these 4 amino acids are then positioned properly in quartets: adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine, A, C, G, and T. The code is positional based on the locations in the chromosomes. But here's an interesting thing. It interprets itself. So here you have a program, and every program that I know of requires an interpreter, requires a computer, requires some hardware to run it. And this basically ultimately winds up running itself. It builds its own little computer to run itself. It is the blueprint for one copy of you. It can be modified by the environment. You have the whole area of epigenetics. And we have deciphered enough of the code so that CRISPR can be used to manually modify the programming language. Now here, this is interesting. No one would decipher randomness. Why would you even consider doing that? You say this is nonsense, this is gibberish. But we have hundreds of billions, actually trillions of dollars being spent over the years on deciphering the human genome, on understanding the structure of DNA. But we continue to learn more. It turns out DNA is even more complex than we thought. Scientists at the University of Washington were stunned to discover that genomes use the genetic code to write 2 separate languages. One describes how proteins are made, and the other instructs the cell on how genes are controlled. And one language is written on top of the other, so that the second language wound up hidden for a very long time. Here's an interesting quote. For over 40 years, we've assumed that DNA changes affecting the genetic code solely impact how proteins are made. Now we know that this basic assumption about reading the human genome missed half of the picture. These new findings highlight that DNA is an incredibly powerful information storage device, which nature has fully exploited in unexpected ways. The genetic code uses a 64-letter alphabet called codons, and the University of Washington team discovered that some of the codons, which they call duons, can have 2 meanings. One related to protein sequence and one related to gene control. And their thought, this is a direct quote from them, these 2 meanings seem to have evolved in concert with each other. That's crazy. The idea that this is evolved rather than designed. The gene control instructions appear to help stabilize certain beneficial features of proteins and how they're made. Okay, then It turns out it's even more complex than that. We now know that the noise in DNA is part of the program. So what you have in your genome, you have huge spaces on the chromosomes where it's just noise, or appears to be noise. And for the better part of 40 years, it's been thought to be just noise, just random stuff. Well, it turns out it's not random. We now know that the noise is actually acting to provide additional instructions regarding the expression of proteins, among other functions. So, for example, if it's insulin being produced, that noise acts almost like a rheostat, so that you can tune it to produce more or less. Interesting stuff. And they keep discovering more because the programming is yet even more complex than that. Because another programming language has now been discovered, completely different, outside DNA. It's called non-neural bioelectricity. It turns out that cells communicate using non-neural bioelectricity. Voltage, polarity, length of transmission all form a language between the cells. So the cells are talking to one another. The language is not very well understood at this point. It's a fairly recent discovery, but we are already able to edit it. Whereas DNA and the cell are like computer hardware and they have hardwired programming, non-neural bioelectricity is similar to communications over the internet and is more like programmable software. I'm going to stop this share and we're going to start up another one so that I can show you a very interesting screen.
So most of us have this mental model in biology that DNA is a property of every living thing, that it is kind of the software that builds the hardware of our body. That's how a lot of us think about this. That model leaves too many deep mysteries. Can you share with us some of those mysteries and also what tadpoles have to do with it?
Sure. I'd like to give you another perspective on this problem. So one of the things that DNA does is specify the hardware of each cell. So the DNA tells every cell what proteins it's supposed to have. And so when you have tadpoles, for example, you see the kind of thing that most people think is sort of a progressive unrolling of the genome. Specific genes turn on and off. And a tadpole, as it becomes a frog, has to rearrange its face. So the eyes, the nostrils, the jaws, everything has to move. And one way to think about it used to be that, well, you have a sort of hardwired set of movements where all of these things move around and then you get your frog. But actually, a few years ago, we found a pretty amazing phenomenon, which is that if you make so-called Picasso frogs, so these are tadpoles where the jaws might be off to the side, the eyes are up here, the nostrils are moved, so everything is shifted. These tadpoles make largely normal frog faces. Now, this is amazing because all of the organs start off in abnormal positions, and yet they still end up making a pretty good frog face. And so what it turns out is that this system, like many living systems, is not a hardwired set of movements, but actually works to reduce the error between what's going on now and what it knows is a correct frog face configuration. This kind of decision-making that involves flexible responses to new circumstances, in other contexts, we would call this intelligence. And so what we need to understand now is not only the mechanisms by which these cells execute their movements and gene expression and so on, but we really have to understand the information flow. How do these cells cooperate with each other to build something large and to stop building when that specific structure is created? And these kinds of computations, not just the mechanisms, but the computations of anatomical control are the future of biology.
And so I guess the traditional model is that somehow cells are sending biochemical signals to each other that allow development to happen, the smart way. But you think there is something else at work. What is that?
Well, cells certainly do communicate biochemically and via physical forces, but there's something else that's going on that's extremely interesting. And that is that it's basically called bioelectricity, non-neural bioelectricity. So it turns out that all cells, not just nerves, but all cells in your body communicate with each other using electrical signals. And what you're seeing here is a time-lapse video. For the first time, we are now able to eavesdrop on all of the electrical conversations that the cells are having with each other. So think about this. We're now watching, this is an early frog embryo. This is about 8 hours to 10 hours of development. And the colors are showing you actual electrical states that allows you to see all of the electrical software that's running on the genome-defined cellular hardware. And so these cells are basically communicating with each other who's going to be head, who's going to be tail, who's going to be left and right, and make eyes and brain and so on. And so it is this software that allows these living systems to achieve specific goals such as building an embryo or regenerating a limb for animals that do this. And the ability to see these electrical conversations gives us some really remarkable opportunities to target or to rewrite the goals towards which these living systems are operating.
Okay, so this is pretty radical. Let me see if I understand this. What you're saying is that when an organism starts to develop, as soon as the cell divides, electrical signals are shared between them. But as you get to, a few hundred cells, that somehow these signals end up forming a kind of, essentially like a computer program, a program that somehow includes all the information needed to tell that organism what its destiny is. Is that the right way to think about it?
Yes, quite. Basically what happens is that these cells, by forming electrical networks, much like networks in the brain, they form electrical networks, and these networks process information, including pattern memories. They include representation of large-scale anatomical structures where various organs will go, what the different axes of the animal, front and back, head and tail, are going to be. And these are literally held in the electrical circuits across large tissues in the same way that brains hold other kinds of memories and learning.
So is this the right way to think about it? Because this seems to me such a big shift. I mean, when I first got a computer, I was in awe of the people who could kind of do so-called machine code, like the direct programming of individual bits in the computer. That was impossible for most mortals. To have a chance of controlling that computer, you'd have to program in a language, which was just a vastly simpler way of making big picture things happen. And if I understand you right, what you're saying is that most of biology today has sort of taken place trying to do the equivalent of machine code programming, of like understanding the biochemical signals between individual cells, when, wait a sec, holy crap, there's this language going on, this electrical language, which if you could understand that would give us a completely different set of insights into how organisms are development. Is that metaphor basically right?
Yeah, this is exactly right. So if you think about the way programming was done in the 40s, in order to get your computer to do something different, you would physically have to shift the wires around. So you would have to go in there and rewire the hardware. You would have to interact with the hardware directly, and all of your strategies for manipulating that machine would be at the level of the hardware. And the reason we have this now amazing technology revolution, information sciences and so on, is because computer science moved from a focus on the hardware onto understanding that if your hardware is good enough, and I'm going to tell you that biological hardware is absolutely good enough, then you can interact with your system not by tweaking or rewiring the hardware, but actually you can take a step back and give it stimuli or inputs the way that you would give to a reprogrammable computer, and cause the cellular network to do something completely different than it would otherwise have done. So the ability to see these bioelectrical signals is giving us an entry point directly into the software that guides large-scale anatomy, which is a very different approach to medicine than to rewiring specific pathways inside of every cell.
And so in many ways, this is the amazingness of your work, is that you're starting to crack the code of these electrical signals. And you've got an amazing demonstration of this in these flatworms. Tell us what's going on here.
So this is a creature known as a planarian. They're flatworms. They're actually quite a complex creature. They have a true brain, lots of different organs, and so on. And the amazing thing about these planaria is that they are highly, highly regenerative. So if you cut it into pieces, in fact, over 200 pieces, every piece will rebuild exactly what's needed to make a perfect little worm. So think about that. This is a system where every single piece knows exactly what a correct planarian looks like and builds the right organs in the right places, and then stops. And that's one of the most amazing things about regeneration. So what we discovered is that if you cut it into 3 pieces and amputate the head and the tail, and you just take this middle fragment, which is what you see here, amazingly, there is an electrical gradient head to tail that's generated that tells the piece where the heads and the tails go, and in fact, how many heads or tails you're supposed to have. So what we learn to do is to manipulate this electrical gradient. And the important thing is that we don't apply electricity. What we do instead was we turn on and off the little transistors. They're actually ion channel proteins that every cell natively uses to set up this electrical state. And so now we have ways to turn them on and off. And when you do this, one of the things you can do is you can shift that circuit to a state that says, no, build 2 heads, or in fact, build no heads. And what you're seeing here are real worms that have either 2 or no heads that result from this, because that electrical map is what the cells are using to decide what to do. And so what you're seeing here are live 2-headed worms. And having generated these, we did a completely crazy experiment. You take one of these 2-headed worms and you chop off both heads and you leave just a normal middle fragment. Now keep in mind, these animals have not been genomically edited. There's absolutely nothing different about their genomes. Their genomic sequence is completely wild type. So you amputate the heads, you've got a nice normal fragment, and then you ask in plain water, what is it going to do? And of course, the standard paradigm would say, well, if you've gotten rid of this ectopic extra tissue, the genome is not edited, so it should make a perfectly normal worm. And the amazing thing is that that is not what happens. These worms, when cut again and again, in the future, in plain water, they continue to regenerate as 2-headed. Think about this. The pattern memory to which these animals will regenerate after damage has been permanently rewritten. And in fact, we can now write it back and send them back to being 1-headed without any genomic editing. So this right here is telling you that the information structure that tells these worms how many heads they're supposed to have is not directly in the genome. It is in this additional bioelectric layer. Probably many other things are as well. And we now have the ability to rewrite it. And that, of course, is the key definition of memory. It has to be stable, long-term stable, and it has to be rewritable. And we're now beginning to crack this morphogenetic code to ask, how is it that these tissues store a map of what to do, and how we can go in and rewrite that map to new outcomes.
I mean, that seems incredibly compelling evidence that there's, that DNA is just not controlling the actual final shape of these organisms. That there's this whole other thing going on. And boy, if you could crack that code, what else could that lead to? By the way, just look at these worms. What is life like for a 2-headed flatworm? I mean, it seems like it's a kind of a trade-off. Like, the good news is you have this amazing 3-dimensional view of the world, but the bad news is you have to poop through both of your mouths.
So the worms have these little tubes called pharynxes, and the tubes are sort of in the middle of the body, and they excrete through that. These animals are perfectly viable. They're completely happy, I think. The problem, however, is that the 2 heads don't cooperate all that well, and so they don't really eat very well. But if you manage to feed them by hand, they will go on forever. And in fact, you should know these worms are basically immortal. So these worms, because they are so highly regenerative, they have no age limit. And they're telling us that if we crack the secret of regeneration, which is not only growing new cells, but knowing when to stop. You see, this is absolutely crucial. If you can continue to exert this really profound control over the 3-dimensional structures that the cells are working towards, you could defeat aging as well as traumatic injury and things like this. So one thing to keep in mind is that this ability to rewrite the large-scale anatomical structure of the body is not just some weird planarian trick. It's not just something that works in flatworms. So what you're seeing here is a tadpole with an eye and a gut. And what we've done is we've turned on very specific ion channels. So we basically just manipulated these little electrical transistors that are inside of cells. And we've imposed a state on some of these gut cells that's normally associated with building an eye. And as a result, what the cells do is they build an eye. These eyes are complete. They have optic nerve, lens, all the same retina, all the same stuff that an eye is supposed to have. They can see, by the way, out of these eyes. And what you're seeing here is that by triggering eye-building subroutines in the physiological software of the body, you can very, very easily tell it to build a complex organ. Now, this is important for biomedicine because we don't know how to micromanage the construction of an eye, and I think it's going to be a really long time before we can really bottom-up build things like eyes or hands and so on. But we don't need to, because the body already knows how to do it, and there are these these subroutines that can be triggered by specific electrical patterns that we can find. And this is what we call cracking the bioelectric code. We can make eyes, we can make extra limbs. Here's one of our 5-legged tadpoles. We can make extra hearts. We're starting to crack the code to understand where are the subroutines in this software that we can trigger and build these complex organs long before we actually know how to micromanage the process at the cellular level.
So as you've started to get to learn this electrical layer and what it can do, you've been able to create, is it fair to say it's almost like a novel life form called a xenobot? Talk to me about xenobots.
Right. So this, if you think about this, this leads to a really strange prediction. If the cells are really willing to build towards a specific map, we could take genetically unaltered cells, and what you're seeing here is cells taken out of a frog body. They've coalesced in a way that asks them to re-envision their multicellularity. And what you see here is that when liberated from the rest of the body of the animal, they make these tiny little novel bodies that are, in terms of behavior, you can see they can move, they can run a maze. That are completely different from frogs or tadpoles. Frog cells, when asked to re-envision what kind of body they want to make, do something incredibly interesting. They use the hardware that their genetics gives them. For example, these little hairs, these little cilia that are normally used to redistribute mucus on the outside of a frog, those are genetically specified. But what these creatures did, because the cells are able to form novel kinds of bodies, they have figured out how to use these little cilia to instead row against the water and now have locomotion. So not only can they move around, but they can. And here, what you're seeing is that these cells are coalescing together. Now they're starting to have conversations about what they are going to do. You can see here the flashes are these exchanges of information. Keep in mind, this is just skin. There is no nervous system. There is no brain. This is just skin. This is skin that has learned to make a new body and to explore its environment and move around. And they have spontaneous behaviors. You can see here where it's swimming down this maze. At this point, it decides to turn around and go back where it came from. So it has its own behavior. And this is a remarkable model system for several reasons. First of all, it shows us the amazing plasticity of cells that are genetically wild type. There's no genetic editing here. These are cells that are really prone to making some sort of functional body. The second thing, and this was done in collaboration with Josh Bongard's lab at UVM, they modeled the structure of these things and evolved it in a virtual world. So this is literally on a computer. They modeled it on a computer. So this is literally the only organism that I know of on the face of this planet whose evolution took place not in the biosphere of the Earth, but inside a computer. So the individual cells have an evolutionary history, but this organism has never existed before. And it was evolved in this virtual world. And then we went ahead and made it in the lab, and you can see this amazing plasticity. So this is not only for making useful machines. You can imagine now programming these to go out into the environment and collect toxins and clean up, or you can imagine ones made out of human cells that would go through your body and collect cancer cells, or reshape arthritic joints, deliver pro-regenerative compounds, all kinds of things. But not only these useful applications, this is an amazing sandbox for learning to communicate morphogenetic signals to cell collectives. So once we crack this, once we understand how these cells decide what to do, and then we're going to, of course, learn to rewrite that information. The next steps are great improvements in regenerative medicine, because we will then be able to tell cells to build healthy organs. And so this is now a really critical opportunity to learn to communicate with cell groups, not to micromanage them, not to force the hardware, but to communicate and rewrite the goals that these cells are trying to accomplish.
What we're seeing is, from what you just saw, terrestrial biology requires intelligence. You may have noticed that he said, we evolved this in a computer. It was intelligence designing that little xenobot. It wasn't evolved at all. In fact, he proved just the opposite of what he thought he was proving. So the incredible level of complexity within the cell, and now between the cells, and this whole programming language displays massive intelligence. The only source we know for intelligence is a mind. In the beginning, God. The mind. Can you imagine a program that has no programmer? And yet that's essentially what he is saying through all of this. They're missing it. It's so basic. Or a computer that has no designer, hardware that happened all by itself. And then what they're doing is reverse engineering. So if they can figure out the code and how the code works, they're reverse engineering it. Can you reverse engineer something that never had an engineer?